Hi friends, you're listening to the Shattered Ceilings podcast with your hosts Stephanie and Andreea. We're here to discuss the importance of mental health from the perspective of two first-generation immigrants. Join in weekly as we dive into important topics such as relationships, parenting, and cultural barriers. Here, we get real and candid as we explore what disrupting the status quo looks like for each of us.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Shattered Ceilings podcast. It is just me. Andreea is still out. Baby boy was born healthy. He's so cute. I'm going to go cuddle him tomorrow. I can't wait. We have an amazing episode in store for you guys today. It's a topic that is very close to my heart, and I think that you guys will resonate with it a lot and hopefully relate to it. We have a beautiful guest that you guys know and love from our previous episodes, Andreea, Leka.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming back. I know you're super busy, so I feel so blessed that you're able to make time to come back on for an episode.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I had such a great time with you guys last time too.
We got to have Anka again too. And yeah, like I was telling Andreea, our highest, our most interactions that we've had on any episode was the one that her and Anka were on. And I know that it was really helpful to you guys. So super excited about today. We're going to talk about mother and father wounds. It is a very deep, I think that's putting it mildly, topic and subject, but we're going to try to kind of rely on Andrea's professional experience, of course, as a licensed counselor, and try to kind of package as much as we can into it, and at the same time break it down to where you guys understand it, can relate to it. So I'm super excited to talk about it. Before we head into the episode, is there anything you want to share, Andreea, or talk about?
No, I'm excited for this topic, and I'm excited to tackle it. And I will say this as we dive into this, I really want to highlight this. The topic that we're diving into does not, what's a good way, it's not meant to shame, to ridicule, to belittle, to put down parent figures. It is actually quite the opposite. It is intended to understand how God can bring healing and restoration to family dynamics. And I really want to, that's the place that I want to lead from today. And I wanted to highlight that as we dive into it.
Thank you. That was such a perfect disclaimer. You couldn't have put it better. So just kind of to start off the episode, can you explain a bit the concept of mother wounds, father wounds, and how they can affect an individual's emotional well-being?
Yeah, sure. So the topic of attachment. So really from a therapeutic perspective, when I think attachment, I think of the primary figures, and we say parents, but some individuals didn't grow up with parents or caregivers. So parents or caregivers, the attachment is how an individual grew up and learned to relate to the world. Attachment figures are people that share the blueprint of what love and safety is. So in this concept, we're talking about mother and father wounds. So an attachment wound then, so kind of generalized term before we dive into individual mother and father wound, essentially is an injury that developed in an attachment. So an injury that developed relational, that is, that caused betrayal, that caused sadness, that was due to, in some cases, neglect, in some cases, miscommunication, etc. So that's the concept.
So abandonment too could be another example of.
Yeah, abandonment too, but I think the line that kind of we're walking there is abandonment can also be a form of attachment trauma. So attachment wounding versus attachment trauma. Attachment trauma is more repetitive, serious, more severe type of pain. And then a wounding is a relational injury, such as, parent wasn't there in time of need once. It didn't lead to trauma, but it led to pain, and it led to obviously emotional discomfort. So that's kind of how I'm feeling.
Okay. My next question would be, how do you identify if a person is struggling with issues related to their mother or father wounds during a therapy session? How would you identify, or how would a therapist identify that?
Yeah, sure. No, great question. So in the context of attachment, we have 4 different attachment styles, and this will kind of lead into to answer the question. So secure attachment means that a parent was often attuned to you and responsive to your needs and wants. Now, there is no perfect parent, there is no perfect child, and there's no perfect human. Let's just create that disclaimer. There is no perfect parenting. there are good forms of parenting and healthy forms of parenting, but then there's also unhealthy ones.
So my second question then would be, how does a therapist identify if a person is struggling with issues related to mother or father wounds during the therapy sessions?
Great question. I think in light of, and maybe one of the things that will help identify how we classify wounding, how we classify, how wounds show up relationally. We use 4 different terms, and in light of attachment, that's secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant, and ambivalent, right? And so secure attachment means parent was attuned to you. You felt connected. There was a safety relationally with the parent. Anxious, obviously, parents sometimes attuned, but there's a sense of anxiety from the child, not knowing if parent will come home, not knowing that they have that relational safety, avoidant, so the child learned to just not ask anymore. And then ambivalent attachment is basically when parent was really hot and really cold. So sometimes really attuned, sometimes really didn't attune, and that led to confusion. And so when a client comes in and we're working with wounding, how do I identify that? Is generally what I find there's a lot of what we call limiting core beliefs. And so a core belief is like, I don't feel wanted, or I don't feel loved, or I feel useless, or so these are classified as limiting core beliefs versus I know I'm wanted, I know I belong, I know I matter, I know I'm important to people. So oftentimes when individuals present with attachment wounding, which oftentimes also leads to anxiety, right? Imagine operating in the world from a place of I don't know if I matter. I don't know if people care about me. I don't know. That creates sometimes depression and anxiety, but oftentimes we see a lot of anxiety in the way people operate in the world when they're suffering from that. And another way we identify is it's really hard for them relationally to be able to give what they don't feel they have. So they come in with a lot of relational concerns. Okay, my marriage isn't working, my dating relationship isn't working, or I'm having a really hard time navigating my relationship with siblings, with parents, with friends, with etc. So it comes and it shows up in relationship. And one of the ways it shows up that we work to identify and we help identify is where repair is really difficult. So when a relationship is really hard to repair, then oftentimes you go back to understand the attachment system and where repair became really difficult.
So it's kind of like a case by case basis, you would say.
Yeah, it's a case by case basis, absolutely. And so when we dive into working with clients, like we look at the whole picture. There's the attachment, there's wounding pieces, sometimes there's trauma pieces, sometimes there's the cultural component, the spiritual component. So we keep all things in mind. But very specifically when working with attachment, we find a lot of limiting beliefs. So it's very hard for clients to think in the concept of relationship with an anxious attachment. Is this do they really love me? If we're in conflict, maybe I should call again, maybe I should text again, or then you have somebody who's avoidantly attached. Whatever, they don't care about me anyway. What's the point of reaching out again? Or what's the point of repair? Right. And then you have that ambivalent attachment, which is like hot or cold. Let me really, really, really try this time. Oh, let me not try this time. And so this is kind of how the relational concerns show up. And so they become issues. Absolutely in life, and they will show up and they will surface.
That's so fascinating to me. I definitely can tell that I'm going into the right field because learning about this is so fascinating because it really is, like you said, I guess you guys look at it as a holistic approach. You look at all the different factors that play in. And I wanted to ask, does this have anything to do with the adverse childhood experiences test? Do you guys use that to determine like any trauma or wounds?
Yeah. And I think especially when you're working with or you have a clinician who specializes in working with child and developmental, or you have marriage and family work where attachment is the premise of the work, where you find tests like that are used more often. Yeah. So that's where you'll probably find tests like that utilized. Yeah.
So what I found fascinating, and I was thinking of when you were explaining the different attachment styles, was the secure attachment, which it's very interesting. I believe that my husband definitely had a secure attachment with his parents. And then I actually took the other day, because I just saw a video, the adverse childhood experiences childhood test, which is basically like they rate you 1 to 10. And I think it's like the higher you are, the higher your risk to basically have like negative experiences in life or like bad experiences. And like my husband rated a 0 and I rated a 7. And it was just interesting to see because I don't think I had that secure attachment with my parents like he did. So I kind of wonder like if that played at all into if it was a factor kind of that would play into that. So
Yeah, and attachment, because again, it shows up in how, when I think attachment figure, I think I learned this as the blueprint of love and safety. This is my basis. When I go back, when I relate to God, when I relate to other people, I relate based off of what I learned about attachment and safety. Oftentimes when we find individuals who have severe trauma, they have a hard time relating to God and understanding, and even having a felt sense and understanding of God, because they have so much in their system, so much accrued environmentally, what they've been through, what they've experienced. And so it will show up. It will absolutely.
And I love how you mentioned the blueprint. Your parents are kind of like the blueprint for love and safety. I see that so much. Like, for example, with my husband, and I say this all the time, like he knew like what a healthy marriage looked like because that's what he saw. Like he knew what a healthy family was. His parents were the blueprint. And so for me, I kind of was just like, okay, well, like let's go along with. And sometimes I felt a bit like an imposter because it's not something that I knew or I saw growing up. So, I kind of just, a lot of my healing, I think, happened when I kind of just looked at him and was like, okay, you had, the blueprint from your parents and your family. Let's go along. And, God kind of came alongside us, of course. And so I love how you said that it is the blueprint. And it reminds me of our importance as parents of like being that blueprint for our kids.
Yes, absolutely. And in light of, since we're talking about obviously a heavy topic, I really do think that the Lord, and I think about God renewing our mind. I think about God healing and redeeming our stories. I think the Lord can heal and redeem our stories completely. Every single area of our life, every wound that we have, every pain, all our traumas. I think God is in the business of restoration. And he absolutely, regardless of the circumstances of our life growing up, regardless of our attachment, regardless of our trauma, God can absolutely heal us.
Yeah, and that's such a beautiful reminder because, of course, we are Christians, and just having, I think also my life is a testament to that, just because science says that the higher that I rate 7 out of 10, I should be, who knows, doing drugs in prison, like all these things, all these statistics. And I truly believe like I'm a living testament to the fact that God is real and he is in the business of restoration. Because to me, it doesn't make sense that I would be able to be like the mother that I am or the wife that I am because of, my childhood. But I think it's such a beautiful reminder. So I love how you said that.
Yeah, what a beautiful testimony.
I kind of want to go into the next question, which is like, what are some common patterns or behaviors? Because I think this is super important to get from your perspective. Some common patterns or behaviors that are exhibited by individuals with mother wounds, and how do they differ from those with father wounds?
Yeah, so great question. So our parents aren't perfect because we're imperfect beings. We're imperfect as well. And so when I take into consideration that we are now part of what is a fallen world, that sin is amongst us, that disease is amongst us, that, and I'm thinking again, in context of everything, that wounds happen and traumas happen. And when I think of father and mother wounds, I'm going to give two scientific examples, and then I'll touch it on a little bit more. So obviously, I want to keep in context a lot of what I'm saying. Also, there's a cultural component as well. There's different components, but I'm going to try to generalize as much as possible so that we can reach viewers. But an example for, let's say, a mother-daughter relationship. Wounds or insecure attachment in daughter-mother relationships put daughters at a risk for low self-esteem, codependency, and inability to self-regulate emotion and self-soothe, and relationship challenges. So this is just one example, which means what? As a, let's say, teenage young girl who shows up in relationship and friendship with a history of, let's say, a poor relationship with mom, it was really, really tough. It was tough to connect with mom. It was tough to relate to mom. And now shows up into the world with wounding. It shows up with an inability and sometimes hardships to regulate emotion. Part of creating a healthy and secure attachment is a parent attuning to a child's needs. A child cannot regulate their own emotion and relies heavily on parents to be able to regulate their emotion. So when that interference doesn't happen or is wounded or you name it, then that creates a disruption in the child. It creates a missing experience, essentially. It's something that a child needed fundamentally, that we know based off of research, based off of basic developmental needs. and now has a missing spirit. So now let's talk a little bit about a father wound. So a symptom of a father wound for both sons and daughters is feeling as though you are not worthy enough and need to seek approval from others, especially other men. Women, for example, with a father wound may find themselves in future relationships with men who are emotionally unavailable, especially if their fathers were absent or not home enough to establish a bond.
Mhm.
So men oftentimes suffer from a father wound if they were raised by a belittling or demeaning father figure who exerted dominance
Okay.
over the child versus relationally, stayed relational as well. And so this is interesting because what we even the environment that we grew up in, let's say that the environment was not always very healthy. If the environment continuously remained unhealthy, then even if it wasn't healthy, it's familiar. And so what ends up happening is that familiarity becomes comfortable. And all of a sudden, that if we had to choose, and this is kind of how generational things are passed on, like generational traumas, is if a parent or parents are in what is, again, this is somewhat of an extreme case, domestic violent situation, the child then becomes comfortable in that violence. And it almost like is interpreted as safe, even though we know that it's not, but it's comfortable and familiar. And so what ends up happening is the child then goes into adulthood and almost chooses that same dynamic, not because it's good, but because it's comfortable. And that comfort, because it's all they've known, now becomes what's familiar and what I cling to and that's the idea of how, things are passed on generationally, which is an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about attachment. And so this is the idea. So we see these fundamental differences, I mean, similarities even in the wounding that happens and how the wounding in a childhood then impacts an adult or a teenager going into adulthood. And then you dive into marriage and dating. And all of a sudden, there's a saying in our field that says, if you don't deal with your woundings and traumas, your marriages will. Why? Because now you're in a relationship with somebody who's really close to you, and it's an emotionally intimate relationship. And what happens? All our stuff surfaces.
Right. Yeah.
The tango of attachments, my attachment, his attachment, all of a sudden we're tangoing. And it's the tango of the wounds as well.
Right. I see. And I think that's where, I mean, just for me, for example, I didn't really have a lot of that showing up until I got into my first relationship, which luckily was my husband. He was my first boyfriend, and we got married really quick. So I kind of had to confront all of that, in the first year. And I see that sometimes that can be definitely exacerbated or discovered when you are in a relationship like that with another person, especially somebody who has obviously a different attachment style than you. So
absolutely.
And I definitely just kind of piggybacking off of that, I wanted to ask, how can unresolved mother-father wounds impact a person's relationship, particularly in romantic or parental context? How have you seen it negatively or positively affect?
Sure. So let me give you an example of what would be classified as maybe like a negative result of unresolved wounds. So expecting your spouse to read your mind.
Okay.
Instead of asking for what you need, avoiding hard topics entirely or shutting down. That's kind of like that avoidance, relational type, attachment type, or taking things personally. Everything feels personal. Everything feels like an attack. So all of these are ways in which our attachment shows up relationally. Because our relationship with parents and caregivers creates our attachment style, then our relationships, kind of leading to what I was saying, our relationships become the tangle of attachment. So for example, we oftentimes find that an anxiously attached person connects with an avoidantly attached person. It's like the perfect tangle between the two. And so I did a little bit research and kind of just adding to that, and I want to share a little bit about why that happens. And so research tells us that anxious avoidant relationships are initially attractive for both persons because their partners fulfill their prior beliefs of what intimacy is supposed to be like. So for example, I'm going to name a random name. Jill, with her anxious attachment style, expects her spouse to be distant. And when she confronts him, he naturally meets those expectations. Let's say with his avoidance attachment, believes all women are needy and demeaning. And this is exactly how Jill behaves. And so all of a sudden now you see these two expectations, almost like fears that become projected in relationships now are what we call the tango of attachment. It's how our stuff shows up relationally, and it really does. And it creates dynamics. And think of in the context of how can this also work to our advantage? When you have two people that are securely attached, how beautiful, which means what? They have this hope of repair relationally. They can be in conflict, and conflict isn't always the worst thing in the world. Unhealthy conflict isn't healthy, but conflict can actually bring relationships together. It's a part of life. It's part of relationships. You have two people that, even if they grew up in the same church, let's say, in the same city, in the same cultural place, and yet such different personality types, different attachment, just so different. And then you put them together and they marry in holy matrimony, and now you have to figure out their stuff because it'll come up, right? And so this is a part of life, but that doesn't have to be the deal breaker. And so in attachment wounding, what ends up happening is that stuff comes up, and repair is absolutely possible. But I also think it starts with the individual, and the individual really understanding their story.
So I love how you put that conflict can be a positive thing depending on how you look at it, because especially as Christians, I think that we definitely believe that conflict and dealing with conflict, especially in a relationship, is kind of like polishing. It's like polishing your character to look obviously more like Christ, but also it's kind of like that coming together of two people. And I think that I love that you mentioned that conflict can be a beautiful thing. And I kind of wanted to kind of segue now into talking about how this stuff can show up in our parenting. And I kind of want to get deep and a little bit transparent here, just because doing the research, kind of preparing this episode, I saw a lot of my own mother and father wounds and how they translate into my parenting, which was very good for me to be confronted with, because I think that especially as parents, healing yourself and dealing with these things, you're just a better parent and you're not passing that on to your own kids. So a couple of things that I noticed, my father wound. So my dad, he was a truck driver, and anybody whose dad was a truck driver, yours was too, right, Andrea? You understand, and you know what it's like that your dad is gone a lot, especially as a Romanian. I mean, my dad was a really hard worker, so he was gone a lot. And then when he was home, he was really tired. So he was always just kind of like, okay, dad's home, let him sleep, let him rest. He's going to be back out on the road, whenever he's going to go back out. So maybe not, unknowingly, he might have not been there for me, or might have been avoided because of the fact that he was working so hard. And now as an adult, I can understand that. But I see that showing up for me in, I have a really hard time trusting people. And I don't know if that has to do with that, because I mean, I'm sure you could give me your professional opinion. But I have noticed that I have a hard time, trusting just the people that I'm in relationships with. And for a long time, I think even my husband, I might have put him through the ringer in the beginning, because I trusted him. But a part of me, I do think it might have had to do with that, with, my dad growing up, being gone a lot. But it's kind of like I wanted him to prove himself all the time. So that for me was not so much in my parenting, but definitely in my relationship with him is how it showed up.
Oh, got it. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
When I think of this, and this is kind of like what leads to healing, and I love that you're so self-aware in the way that you said that as an adult, I can look at that and look at that and say, okay, wow, dad was such a hard worker. That is amazing that he cared for us. He cared for our family. This is a good and beautiful thing. Another piece is, and then that left me also with some pain. And both be true, right? It's not that he left me with pain because I was bad, because he was absent. It's not that. It's dad needed to do what he needed to do. And simultaneously, that left me with the missing experience of that relational bond with him, sometimes in developmental years when that's really important. And both can be true. And I think this is kind of what leads to healing.
Yeah.
Is that both of these pieces can be true. And so in light of what you shared, thank you for sharing your vulnerability. That's hard.
Yeah. I hope it can encourage other people, because this subject, that's why it's so fascinating and important to me, because I think we need to talk about mother and father wounds, because when we recognize it, we can, like you said, go to the next step, which would be recognizing that they maybe did the best that they could at that time, which, like you said, in turn leads to healing. Because I think a lot of us may be dealing with a lot of pent up anger and frustration towards our parents, and it's holding us back in our own relationships, even, with our significant others, with our kids. And the first step, I definitely think, is talking about it and acknowledging.
Agreed, agreed. And maybe even putting some, I think another piece is kind of in line of what you're saying, is putting some language to it, to what the experience was like. It's okay for me to say, mom and dad were amazing and they did the absolute best that they could. And there's a piece here that left me with some pain. It doesn't mean because they intended me to be in pain. It doesn't mean because they wanted to me or because they're just neglectful parent. It's not that. It's looking at the story and just sharing, this is my experience in it, and this is how I felt. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to go around shaming people or shaming parents, or it's not that. It's being able to look and share, this has been my experience, and this is how it impacted me personally. And then I can look back and say, they're amazing and they're such hard workers, and they really did try their best. And I think that leads to a healthy dynamic that both can be true simultaneously.
I love that. Yep. Healthy dynamic, exactly like you said, because I'm a huge believer in this, and I say it all the time. I found like a new freedom in my relationship with my parents when I acknowledged, hey, this is how, this made me feel, you not being there, whatever. I had a new freedom and a new like honesty and transparency in my relationship with them. And to me, that's what a true relationship is. Like, if I can be really true and honest with my parents and genuine, and it just led to like a deeper level, I think, of my relationship with them.
Absolutely. And a deeper level of trust that they can hold space for your experience. Right. And sometimes that's tough. And I'm thinking, you're a mama, and so I'm not. So that's also my piece that I want to share mindfully. But when sharing information like this, especially with the parent, I think it's so healing that they hold space for it versus internalize it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because the moment in which it's internalized, it kind of becomes less about this was my experience and more about what does this mean about me. Right. And so I think that you being able to share that with your parents and your family, and then holding space for it and just kind of saying, okay, I see this was your experience. And that's okay for you to have that experience. This is what was real to you. And it's calling it what it was versus saying that this must mean something really bad about me if you had this experience. I think that's really healthy. It doesn't have to be they were bad. They weren't, it didn't sound like they were bad parents.
Also, I think that sometimes you might have to walk your parents through that. And what that feels like, because they might not notice that they're internalizing it, or they might not know how not to do that. Because for me, I had to be sometimes like, look, mom, dad, this is not about me shaming you. This is about me having a better relationship with you. And I have to be open with you about these things. It's about me being a better mom. It's about me being a better wife. I have to talk to you about this. And I think that's hard sometimes because, a lot of, immigrant, we like to kind of sweep things under the rug. And so it's awkward. Nobody wants to really hear that I'm a mom. Like, I don't know. And I'm sure, obviously, in my own way, my kids will have their own things, and they're older, to say about me that I, wasn't doing my best in this or this area. But it's just sometimes like, it's okay to walk your parents through that. And I think when they saw the benefits of me opening up to them and how much better our relationship was, they realized the importance of talking about that stuff.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I think that's when healing happens in families. We heal, we don't pass on.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful.
That's the goal. That's definitely the goal, I think. And especially like now as a mom, I've dealt with, healing from so much, but I still see, because like I said about my father wounds, I see certain things, from, which was very crazy for me to see. Like a mother wound can sometimes make you be like, if you had a very critical mother, you could be very critical with your own kids, which that's exactly how I am with my kids. Like, I expect them to be like little adults. And noticing that was like, wow, like it's because of this. Or another thing was like the hyper independence. Like if you have like a father wound, you can be hyper independent. Again, that's me. Like just noticing that connection kind of makes you feel like, hey, like I knew I wasn't crazy. This is kind of the explanation for it. And now I can go forward to the next step. Like now that I notice that I'm doing these things, I can, make an effort to not, or heal from it and not continue it further.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, and that's absolutely how healing happens. And I think that's how, as the generations go on, we pass on more of the Lord. We pass on more of healthiness. We pass on good things to the generations to come, and we really help them set the stage for healthy living. And that's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful.
I love that. So how important would you say that it is for individuals to confront and heal from mother and father wounds in order to lead fulfilling and balanced lives? I know we kind of touched on this, but then also like what are the potential consequences of neglecting these issues in therapy?
Yeah, well, I think as we were touching on just throughout our chat today is because attachment runs kind of like at the foundation of of love, safety, repair, belonging, all of these, universal needs, uh, that it really is an important thing. And what I mean by that is it's an important thing to understand within yourself about your own story. And actually, in a recent article that I was reading, they had mentioned that one of the most important factors, there's a few different ones, but one of the most important factors in passing on and creating healthy relationship and dynamics in your family, in parenting, uh, in marriages, etc., is having a healthy understanding of your own story, having self-awareness, understanding, and not like with judgment. And I don't mean that judgment towards yourself or towards your parents or towards but with curiosity to really understand how different developmental stages, how different, milestones throughout life, be it good, be it bad, really impacted you and affected you. And a healthy understanding of that and all of that, and I really mean this, like bringing the Lord into all of that,
Mhm.
right? So that it is not about dishonoring people, it's not about dishonoring yourself in the process, but it really is about understanding. And not only that, then as believers, we say, Lord, where were you in here? Help me understand. Bring healing to that part of my life, then to understand where you were as I was suffering at that age when I had lost, when I was suffering at that age. And this is really how our story starts to change. So what I'm saying is when we have a healthy understanding of our stories, we can then pass on healthiness. I cannot give you what I don't have.
Mhm.
I can't give you, if I don't have a healthy mind, if I don't have a healthy heart, if I can't be healthy in my giving because the wellspring of my life, it comes from my heart. I can give you what I have. And so then kind of going back to attachment as being so foundational and so important, neglecting that and neglecting listening to our stories can really lead to us harming others in ways we've been harmed.
Mhm.
That's the generalized idea of it.
Mhm.
Is if people treated you a certain way, you continue treating them a certain way without understanding that, hey, I can really take ownership for this. I didn't cause my wounding and I didn't cause my traumas. They happened to me, but I have the ability to do something about it. And I have the ability to heal. I have the ability to forgive. I have the ability to let go. I have the ability to accept the pieces of my story, the good, the bad. They were part of the story. And now I can determine, and what do I choose to do going forward? And how am I going to let healing impact me right now so that I can go forward and live victoriously in the victorious life that God created it for us? When we're triggered left and right, we're not living in freedom. That's not freedom when we're constantly triggered by things.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I really do think God wants to renew our mind, renew our soul, our spirit, and really make us one with Him, bring healing to all of these different fundamental parts of our lives so that we can be more like Him.
Yeah.
So that we can grow a relationship with Him, so that we can, as we do life, we can show up like Him and start looking like Him and sounding like Him and not triggered and not projecting our stuff, our past pain, our past wounding onto other people.
Yeah.
As we are the people of the Lord, and how we show up matters.
Ooh, that was powerful.
Yeah.
I love that. No, everything, yeah, that was so beautiful. And also I'm just thinking now as you're talking about that, I think that also helps us not to fall into this like victim mentality,
Right.
and be like stuck, in a certain experience or time in our life. And one thing, I mean, I feel like I can say for myself is it is always a journey. you think like, I think like, oh, I've healed from this, but I still have this one component that I need to work on. And like you said, coming together with the Lord and, like, God, heal me from this, teach me how to move forward, like change my behaviors, change my attitudes about this. And I think if you look at it like that as a journey, it's easier not to get stuck in a certain place, not to be frustrated, and to just continue moving forward. And like, we're human, as long as we're going to be on earth, we'll have this stuff to deal with. But, God is here to, like you said, heal these things. And he wants us to live like an abundant life where we're not, like you said, triggered by this. But it takes, I think, like you said, talking about it and acknowledging those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And putting language around it. I love that.
Yeah. So what advice do you offer to clients who are trying to navigate these like complex relationships with their parents? Especially if those relationships have been a source of emotional pain, or if the parent has a hard time internalizing it and not being open to talking about this stuff.
Yeah, great question. As a starting place, I feel like we can go in so many directions with this question, but I think as a starting place would be to acknowledge your pain. Start by noticing, okay, I'm in pain. Something here in this relationship dynamic is causing me pain, and I have to take a step back right now. And I have to identify what is causing me pain. And the second question I think that ensues is, and what do I need?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if I'm constantly, whether it's putting myself or in a situation where I'm emotionally in pain, then I really have to ask myself, what is happening here? And what do I need so that the emotional pain can stop? Right? And let's say that something you're needing, like the attention of a parent, let's say as an adult, and parent just does not want to chit chat, does not want to confront situations, does not want to deal with that, does not want to, one of the hard part, I think, of being an adult is having to accept people where they're at. And part of that leads, and I think of the stages of grief, what leads to acceptance is this grief of like, I hoped that when I would reach this season of my life, now as an adult in my 30s, let me give you an example, that I would have had a different relationship dynamic with this parent.
Mm-hmm.
That's my story, but that's kind of what I'm saying is, and to get to the place where I'm looking at a parent and saying, okay, this is where they're at, this is what I'm needing. There is a chance this parent can give me what I need. I have to then go back and say, am I willing to have that? And sometimes when I'm having a hard time accepting that, or it doesn't have to be with a parent, it could be with a friend, it could be with anyone. I have to really take a step back and say, what is keeping me from accepting really where they're at? And maybe now is not a season where they want to talk about things. And maybe now is not a season where, things are going to be dealt with or addressed but what can I do about it?
Mm-hmm.
I can learn to accept where they're at. And that's a painful place because you have to visit grief. You
Yeah.
have to go through the grief of I was hoping and I thought it was going to be different, but this is where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that eventually leads to acceptance.
So one beautiful thing that I read that I thought of when you just said is accepting kind of and going through that grief stage of the relationship you would have hoped for. I read something and it like resonated so much with me. It was like when you realize that the way somebody treats you or like if they do something to you speaks more about their internal struggle, that's when you start to learn what grace means. And I was like, oh my goodness, like that was such an eye-opener for me because a lot of times, I'll be honest, like if somebody treats me a certain way, I'm like, I make it about me. Why are they treating me like that? Why are they acting out like this? But if I step back and I look at like, no, that their action is more about their internal world and what they're going through and their struggle, it kind of helps for me to extend more grace, and two, just be more like mindful that like it's not all about me, and it's it might not even have anything to do with me. It just might be what they're going through.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is as we have started this conversation, is in light of our parents, the reality is they're not perfect, we're not perfect, none of us are perfect. And how one of the healing realizations that may even answer this question is, it is likely that they're wounded themselves. And it's likely that in different ways they're in pain themselves. And so to even have this idea tying into what you were saying about how it may have nothing to do with us, I think this is such a pivotal point, because a lot of times, even in the context of attachment, we project what we think is happening versus what may actually be happening.
Mhm.
Because when we feel this big emotion of I feel rejected, let's say because of the way my spouse looked at me, or because of the fact that that rejection wound was triggered on the inside of me, it means that I have a trigger wound on the inside of me
That I need to figure out. Yeah.
that I need to take responsibility over. My wounds and my triggers are my responsibility. They're not my spouse's. They're not my parents. They're my responsibility to heal. And as I recognize that I have the ability to do that, I'm really taking ownership for how I show up in the world.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful. And it really does. I think you mentioned the word victim. It really shifts that victim mindset, because let's say when a child is 5 years old, they don't have a lot of say in what happens in their life.
Mhm.
They can fall victim to things that they didn't ask for, they didn't sign up for, that just happened. But now as a fully functioning adult, I can take ownership and accountability for how I show up in the world. That's also the hope of healing,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Is that I can really take it and I can own it and I can say, listen, I don't like how I'm showing up in this relationship or in this dynamic, or what is it that I need to work through about what happens when I get triggered to that space. And that's the space that we can bring to the Lord in prayer. I would really start there.
Yeah.
The Lord is great at healing. And it's not like healing is a one time and done. Healing is a journey. And it doesn't always look like this perfect linear. It doesn't. Maybe in a perfect world it would. But sometimes it kind of looks a little bit like this. Gosh, I thought I really, I really went into that wound and I really thought I dealt, but oh, it showed up again. Lord, I'm bringing this. It's an act of surrender.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. It keeps us humble, really.
I love it. And I
Yeah.
definitely think every day that we wake up alive and breathing, we have another chance to work on ourselves and work on these, traumas that we deal with. And I don't think we should ever excuse ourselves or stay stuck in that, because like you said, I keep going back to that. God wants us to live in freedom. He doesn't want us to live triggered and constantly. And one of, like you said, the most powerful thing you can do is not live in this victim mentality. Take, responsibility for how you're showing up. That's beautiful. I love how you put that.
Yeah.
So
And
I want to ask, are there any specific therapeutic techniques or approaches that you specifically find effective in helping clients heal from mother or father wounds?
it's like you ask a therapist who specializes in a different modality, and they'll probably attest to their modality as being the best. There are various different modalities that really help highlight this dynamic. Like a lot of attachment related modalities are phenomenal for that. In fact, they base all of their treatment therapeutic interventions on that. And a lot of couples therapists, like marriage and family therapists, they're really, really good at that. In fact, that's probably like their forte in therapy. Mine's trauma, which is obviously connected as well, but marriage and family therapists will be great for really diving into that, but also for doing individual work. There's a modality called cognitive behavioral therapy. And the reason why this came to mind is because one of the therapeutic interventions is called understanding your core beliefs. It's called core beliefs. And the idea is this, that when I have a core belief, and let's say a limiting core belief, let's say I believe about myself that I am not important, okay? That when I show up in relationship, I really tend to shy away because I feel like I'm just not important. When I show up in my family, I'm not going to ask a question or ask for what I need because I feel like I'm not important. So this therapeutic intervention essentially says that when I have a belief, a core belief, let's say, that I'm not important, it's almost like wearing glasses.
Mhm.
Where on top of those glasses, let's say the words "I'm not important" are written. And then what ends up happening is I look at life through that lens. When I believe that about myself, that per my pain and wounding and traumas, and I've accrued some kind of evidence that I'm not important, then it almost becomes like the filter at which we live life.
Then that's like only what you look out for, to basically convince yourself of.
Yeah, well, it ends up happening. That's all I see.
Mhm.
You look at even micro situations, and all of a sudden you have the sensitivity. They must mean, and that must have meant that I'm not important.
And
Or,
that's
oh,
where the breakdown in the communication happens in the relationship. Okay.
yes. And so this is really important to keep in mind because this also ties into attachment. And attachment wounding creates limiting beliefs.
Mhm.
And so when there's a wound, let's say where, you know, I'm just going to give you a wild example. Let's say parents were CEOs of a company, and oftentimes parents would be on the phone a lot. And so a child growing up watching mom and dad predominantly on the phone, now again, this is a someone out there example, may have felt in different seasons that they're just not important and they come secondary to the business, right? And so all of a sudden they develop this belief that I'm not important. So they show up in school and they show up in teenage years and they show up in marriage and they don't ask a lot of questions and they don't have a lot of needs and they don't really assert themselves. They don't put up boundaries. They really kind of just survive because they've learned that their needs come secondary, so they don't even bother. So this is an example of kind of having those glasses of I'm not important, and I've just started believing that about myself. And the way he would leave the 99 to come take. And you look at his welcome me back to the prodigal son, and you look at all these stories and you see God's love and intention for us as humanity to remind us how he created us, where we belong in the world as his children, love. Do you see what I mean? Kind of how like attachment comes and plays a part into that. And I think that's why a healthy understanding of scripture of the Lord is imperative in healing all of our wounds.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love how you mentioned, so you would say cognitive behavioral therapy is a great approach or modality to addressing or starting to address some of this.
So that's kind of like a more practical way of doing it and understanding core beliefs. But a lot of the attachment modalities, and there's quite a few of those, would be more helpful in doing kind of like deeper, more in-depth work.
Okay.
Yeah, which I'm happy to share with anyone if anyone has questions. I'm here.
Yes. Andrea is amazing, guys. I'll be scheduling a session with you soon. So just to kind of wrap up today's episode, I know we kind of bounced all over the place, but we had really good, deep, thought-provoking convos that I am honored to have had you on. So thank you, Andrea. And I hope that it related to you guys, or that you guys were able to relate to at least something of what we said today. If anything stood out to you guys, or you would like to have any suggestions or feedback, you guys can go ahead and do that, of course, as always, through the anonymous box that we have in our link tree. Once again, thank you, Andrea, so much. You're so lovely.
Oh, thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you for having me, Steph. You're wonderful.
And you're gonna come on again, so you're not gonna get rid of us.
Of course, glad to do so.
So again, thanks guys so much for listening today. Go ahead and subscribe to all of our channels so you can keep up with our next episodes, and we'll see you back again in 2 weeks. Bye guys.